Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, לעסוק בדברי תורה. וערב אדוני אלוהינו את דברי תורתך בפינו ובפי עמך בית ישראל. ונהיה אנחנו וצאצאינו וצאצאי עמך בית ישראל. כולנו יודע שמך ולומדי תורתך לשמה, ברוך אתה אדוני מלמד תורה לעמו ישראל.
אמן.
אמן. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר בך בנו מכל עמים ונתן לנו תורתו, ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
Amen.
Okay, if you wanted to say something before we get
Just
started.
something, I don't know if it's related or I actually thought of this on my run on Sunday.
Okay.
So I went over it and I went for a run and I'm trying to think of this. So in terms of the slave being classified as immovable, as land, is there something that's going to come up that their status is changed from movable to immovable? Is their status still considered, are they still considered movable?
Okay, in what do you mean?
When the land is acquired, if the slave standing on the land, then the slave is considered part of the land, which is the slave is effectively immovable property. Does the status of the slave still stay the same, or does the status of the slave become immovable property, or does he always remain immovable property?
Okay, Malcolm, do you want to say something?
So I understand Kevin's question about the slave being part of the land, being immovable. I think Kevin's question is when does the status of the slave become a movable acquisition? Movable. Okay. Yeah. I think that's a question.
Does it change after? Yeah, does it change? Okay, so when it gets acquired, the slave gets acquired with the purchaser, it's considered immovable because it's then revert back to movable after the purchase.
No, let me address the issue. It's a good question. It doesn't go from a status of being seen halachically as land to movable or being seen halachically as movable to land. Okay, the status doesn't change of the slave. There are two halachic opinions. The biblical ordinance in regards to price fraud, as well as the law of oaths. Slave is seen biblically as property in those particular two cases. There are others, but those primarily. And when we go to the Bava Basra, we'll see how that plays out. Please God, we get to do it. So in that particular case, we'll see why the context is halachically they're deemed as land. Okay? But apart from that case, rabbinically, in most cases, they're seen as movables. They're seen as most cases as movables, and that's why Rav Nachman holds that they're movables, but Rav Ula, quoting Rav Ben Elazar, Rav Elazar has said that basically it's considered for him like land. So Rav Nachman's major argument is if you take a case of a presbull, slaves are seen as movables because you cannot do a presbull act with a slave. So the status clearly doesn't change. And then the fact that you can't acquire land with a movable is Rav Nachman's other point. So according to rabbinic law, slaves in most cases are seen as movable. And except for the two cases I mentioned, which were biblical in nature. But you have two opinions of the rabbis. Some that see halachically a slave as land in terms of application of law, and others that see a slave as a movable asset in terms of application of law. But they don't change their status. It's only the rabbis that deem them in two different opinions. They don't change their status at all.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
Okay. So, sorry, Damon, when you said prosbull with the slave, just explain it again?
Yes. So with the prosbull, the prosbull can only be effected if the person owing you money owns a pocket of land, because you technically taking it in the 6th year and saying, listen, your land's not going anywhere. You can be on the land, but you can't physically take land away. It's there. Yes. It's not like a movable that can be used up or you can sell it under somebody's nose. And then obviously the court, the debt is sold to the court. And as the messenger of the court, you can collect it or it will be delivered to you. But the transaction gets transferred from the creditor and the debtor to the debtor and the court.
And the slaves would be considered immovables in that regard.
No, the slaves are considered movable because you can't use a slave to enforce a proselyte document. If a slave was considered immovable property, land, you could enforce a proselyte document. Am I making sense?
So say the last part again. If a slave?
If a slave was seen as immovable property, meaning land, then you can effect a proselyte. But because it's movable, so we'll call it movable asset and fixed property. It's just a cleaner way to keep it in one's mind. Okay.
Thank
Kev,
you.
I hope I've answered your question. Okay, Michael, I hope I've answered yours.
Good question, yeah.
Okay, it is a good question because it does seem like it changes its status. It's just the opinion that the rabbis have of a different status. So quickly, let's bring some halacha in. So the Mishnah Brura on page 178, verse 35. I think it's section 35. I'm not sure. I was getting from Rabbi Daniel Brody. It's not the same one author as the other Daniel Brody. It's Gary Brody's brother. He's a scribe in Johannesburg, the brother. And the other brother, Rabbi Daniel Brody, his name is actually spelled Broad, B-R-A-U-D-E, not B-R-O-R-D-E like Rabbi Dan Brody. Okay. So he gives the daily Mishnah Brura shir in writing, which is easier. So we learned that the best advice is not to leave one's place before benching or brocha achroina, whether you're eating bread or mezonot foods, unless one had in mind at the time of hamotzi to eat elsewhere. So that we've already learned.
Okay.
But even if one didn't, he still does not make a new hamotzi when he gets to his second place. Now we're going to discuss what happens if one quickly popped out, either briefly or returns to eat in the place that he was or leaves for good. Okay? I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Okay. So if you continue in the same place, so you leave briefly with the intention to come back to the same place, then you do not need to make Birkat Hazon before you leave. I'm saying, in other words, your mom asks you to take the shopping out the car. She's old and frail. One briefly leaves with the intention that you're going to come back to the same place. So the example that Rabbi Brody gives is that your elderly mother's got shopping and you quickly help her with it out the car. It's going to take 5 minutes. So you're technically eating. Then you do not have to make a new hamotzi. The only time you'd have to make a new Birkat Hamazon before popping out is when you think you were going to be gone for quite a while, or you can't ascertain how long you're going to be going out, in which case there's a worry that you'll get distracted or will no longer be full enough to bench. Okay? All right.
What is the time that you can, you have dinner and you're sitting around lounging? What is the time that you have to bench within?
All right, so I'll give you the sources of it.
I'll tell you.
It's in Mishnah Brura, 184, verse 4. It's chapter 180. It's chapter 184, verse 4, and in the Shulchan Aruch, it's in chapter 184, verse 1. Okay, so it's that's where you find the two sources, and it has to be a full 72 minutes.
Okay.
I thought it was 1 hour and 18 minutes. As it said, 1 hour 12 minutes.
Yeah, it's 1 hour and 12 minutes. It's 72, and we see that number being used quite a bit. I'm not sure where they get it from. Okay, so if you left and you have no intent to return, and you're not going to eat elsewhere, you should actually bench before you left. Obviously, if it's going to take too much time. I don't know. We learned yesterday that in an emergency you can do it where you are at, but it has to be a real emergency. Preferably, I don't know anybody that's got an emergency that you have to leave in the next 2 minutes and you can't do Birkat Hamazon. You know what I'm saying, really? Unless your mom's calling you to take stuff out the car, but then it's a very short period of a distraction. All right, if a person mistakenly didn't bench before going to the office, should ideally go back home to bench there. If that will take too much time, he can bench at the office. And I think we learned that you continue with a bit of food at the office, just to extend the time period. All right, guys, let's go to the actual shir. Mishnah, that properties that are not subject to the law of Me'ilah, you don't have to pay. If it's not subject to the law of Me'ilah, you have to pay for damages. If it is subject to the law of Me'ilah, you don't have to pay for damages. So what is that implying, guys? It's implying that one is liable for damage even though it's consecrated property. And we learned before that the rabbis hold that you don't have to pay for damage if it's consecrated property. So our first confusion is, how do we view it like that? Only we know Rabbi Kiva says that you have to pay for damage to consecrated property, but the rabbis seem to imply that you don't. So they want to know who's the Tana that maintains the view. So Rav Yochanan said, the Mishnah refers to Kodshim Kalim and follows the opinion of Rav Yosef Haglili, who maintains that Kodshim Kalim are considered the property of the owner. Okay? And as it was taught in the Brisa, the Torah states in reference to one who falsely claims and swears in denial of a monetary claim, if a person will sin and will commit a treachery against Hashem by lying to his fellow. This verse comes to include Kodashim Kalim in the law of false oaths, for Kodashim Kalim are deemed the property of their possessor. These are the words of Rav Yosef Haglili. All right. So, guys, I just wanted to bring two aspects into the shir. Kevin brought an aspect yesterday that was a little confusing to him, is that he thought initially that the two categories were one that basically uses Me'ilah. So Me'ilah is using consecrated items for personal use, and Kodshim is holy vessels or holy sacrifices that are dedicated to the temple, they're consecrated, and they're known as Hekdesh. So Hekdesh is anything that's consecrated. Me'ilah is anything that is used for personal gain, that's consecrated, which you're not allowed to do. So Gavin thought that the two categories were if it's done on purpose and it's done by accident. He is right that there are two ways that you can transgress. If you do it on purpose, you're subject to the death penalty. If you do it by accident, you have to bring a korban, chattas, etc. So those are the two states of mind when one transgresses Me'ilah. But they're actually two categories of Hekdesh, consecrated items, and they have got different statuses of Me'ilah. In other words, when they are allowed to be used for personal use and when they're not allowed to be used for personal use. So I just wanted to explain this very quickly. Okay, and this is going to help you out. All right. So the sacrificial offerings fall into two categories. The one is Kodshe Kadashim, which is the most holy offerings. And this is a Chattas offering, an Ola offering, and an Asham offering. And then offerings of lesser holiness are known as Kodashim Kalim. And this is Shalamim, Bechor, and Maisa offerings. Okay, so the laws of Me'ilah for these two categories differ. So for Kodshe Kadashim, which is the most high, they're subject to Me'ilah as soon as they're consecrated, meaning when the minute you take it to the temple or you make a verbal declaration that this is going to be consecrated, at that point you cannot get any personal use out of Kodshe Kadashim. Okay, it's the minute words are spoken, even if no action has taken place, they are consecrated. You can't use them. On the other hand, Kodashim Kalim, which are lesser offerings of lesser holiness, they're not subject to Me'ilah until after they've been slaughtered and their blood has been thrown on the altar. Okay, so while they're alive, they're not subject to the laws of Me'ilah, and after they've been slaughtered and their blood has been thrown on the altar, only at that point are they subject to Me'ilah. And even those parts that are not deemed for sacrifice. In other words, when you've got a sacrifice, the Kohen puts some part of the animal upon the altar as well as the blood, but those parts that are eaten by the Kohanim and the owner of the animal are never subject to Me'ilah. So that's from Rashi in the Mishnah of Me'ilah 7b. Okay. So stating that the damaged party must not be subject to Me'ilah, rather than stating simply it must be consecrated property, the Mishnah initially implies that one is liable for damaging Kochim Kalim. For although Kochim Kalim are consecrated property, they are not subject to Me'ilah. That's according to Rashi. So, in other words, what we're learning here is if your ox damages another ox that has not been sacrificed yet, and it's offerings of lower holiness, meaning Kodashim Kalim, and your ox damages his ox, you are responsible for the payment as the ox of one's fellow, because it only transfers ownership at that point. Come on, Kitty.
How is it determined if it's Kodashim or Kodashim Kalim? Because who makes the determination? That's why I'm confused. Because they're both consecrated. You see, how is it determined?
Okay, good question.
You see, because that's what I'm confused about. Because this is the first time I've heard of that, actually, the concept.
Okay, so
they were all Kodashim.
Okay, so that's a very good question. It depends, firstly, on the specification of the animal, as far as I know, but it also has to do with the intent of the animal. So, for example, if you lie under oath, whether you stole an item, etc., you bring an asham offering. So, an asha offering is basically a very serious offering. The same as a khatas offering. You must know how serious it is, that it takes you from the position where you could have had the death penalty, at least at the hands of heaven, being responsible to that degree, and it's now made you in a status where you're forgivable. That's how serious it is. So obviously, if you're intending to do that, like you broke Shabbos accidentally.
Asham offering. You're talking about an asham offering which replaces.
So what I'm saying is exactly that, Kevin, is that if the intent of the offering is more serious, where if you broke Shabbos on purpose, one would get the death penalty, or you accidentally had relations and your wife was in a state of nida, it's kares. But if you bring a khatas, obviously in the case where Hashem knows your intention is accidental, and you bring a khatas, which is a sin offering, that is a kodshay kadashim. That's one of the offerings, and it's very serious. It can take you from the status of damnation to exoneration. Whereas kodashim kalim is for Maisa offerings, meaning a portion of your profits, shalamim, completion offices, bechor, the firstborn. It's not nearly as serious. So because it's not nearly as serious, it is holy, but it's not the same levels at stake. So what you've done wrong would determine what it is.
Oh, thank you. Okay, but it can still be a bull. So you can consecrate.
Sure.
You can dedicate, designate. Both there. That's okay. So it's doesn't. Okay. So it's not such a clear issue. It's a great question, because who would say? I was so confused because I thought a bull was only for the highest offering, for the highest. That's what I thought. I didn't think it was for different statuses of offering. Thank you. You clarified that. Thanks.
And the proof of it, guys, in terms of how good questions Kevin is that if you look at a bechor is what? Marco off? Do you know?
Firstborn, yeah?
Yes. So a cow also gives a firstborn male. It's a firstborn male. So a cow also gives a firstborn. Same as a sheep. As far as I know, it's male. I'm pretty sure it is. Different creatures give firstborn, so that's why it would include an ox, Kev. Definitely. All right. So what we're saying, Kevin, is as follows, is that we learned before with the highest levels of offering that a person was exempt according to the rabbis if their ox hit that offering, because it was considered the offering of the Most High. But we're finding something different here. What are we finding? We're finding that it doesn't make sense that in this case, it says that you are responsible, because it seems to be a contradiction to the previous brisa that we learned. And it's not a contradiction because it's a completely different type of offering. Completely different. And since it's a different type of offering, it's still regarded as a person's offering while they're still alive, while the animal is still alive. Do you get what I'm saying? In other words, the minute the animal has been sacrificed, at that point, you can no longer kill it anyway in a damages action. Why? Because it's already on the altar, and your ox isn't going to hit its ox. But if it's at the highest level of holiness, and the Kodesh Kodashim, in that particular case, if somebody from the temple or you were walking your ox towards that, you would certainly not be responsible, because that's already been dedicated by your sheer verbal declaration that it belongs to the Most High.
Right.
To Hashem. So therefore, it's not a contradiction at all. In the previous Gemaras, the rabbis were talking in a case of it being the highest offering, and here we're saying that there's in fact a different category entirely. Makes sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So with that, we're going to be dealing with one or two other issues. The first issue that we're going to be dealing with is what's the proof of this. So basically, Rava challenged the explanation of Rav Nachman. Okay, because what did Rav Nachman say? He turned around and said that if you're taking the lesser sacrifice of holiness, it's still deemed the property of the individual while it's alive, as well as the property of the Most High. And how do we know that? Is because if somebody swore falsely that they didn't receive such an animal, it says that they're committing treachery against both Hashem and that person individually. So how's that possible? If it belongs to a person, either they are committing treachery against a person, or if it belongs to Hashem, they're committing treachery to Hashem. How can it be both? And the two discussions are generally when you're creating a sin, Hashem forbade you to do it, and therefore you're creating a treachery against Hashem. And when you steal from somebody, you're also creating a treachery against that person. So we're saying both in a normal case, and especially a case where while the animal is alive, in the lesser offering, you own it, but you want to, and your intent is that as soon as the animal is shechted, it goes to Hashem. Okay.
If you've dedicated an ox that's on the highest level, Kodeshim, then if it's lost or stolen, you have to replace that ox. If it's on the Kalim level, on the lower level, you're not responsible. You don't have to replace it.
All right, so let me just explain it, Mark. I'm sorry. Let me just explain it like this. Is that Rashi holds that a Kodashim Kalim, which is a lower level animal, is the property of the owner while it's alive, because if it's lost or stolen, the owner must offer another animal in its stead. Okay. So initially this explanation seems difficult because Kodashim Kalim animals do not necessarily need to be replaced if they're lost or stolen.
Right.
Only whether or not the sacrifice needs to be replaced, depending solely on how the owner phrased his declaration at the time he vowed to bring the sacrifice. So I'm assuming for a Kodashim Kalim, if he says, I'm bringing an animal for a Kodashim Kalim, and he never pointed to an animal or spoke of a particular animal, he'd have to replace it. But if he was referring to a particular animal, he wouldn't have to replace it.
Oh, he wouldn't have to. Okay.
Yes. Because it's that particular animal. I gather from this that if it's a Kodesh Kodashim, that you would have to replace it.
Okay.
So in other words, right. So let's just keep the issue quite simple. So just in summary, there are going to be 4 or 5 issues that are going to come up. The 4 or 5 issues that are going to come up again is are the Gemaras that are going to be coming up in the commentaries talking about in the temple era, or after the temple era? Are they going to talk about within the land of Eretz Yisrael and Yerushalayim, or out of the land of Eretz Yisrael and also out of Yerushalayim? Why? Because there's certain times you can eat an animal according to if it's blemished, not in certain regions, etc. So again, temple times, not in temple times. Inside Israel, outside Israel. Okay, and if it's blemished and unblemished. Why are these factors? Because if it's not suitable for a sacrifice, then certain extenuating circumstances apply. Meaning that you can use it for personal gain in certain circumstances. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
In other words, if there's no temple that still exists, obviously a Kohen has to sell it to a Kohen and wait for a blemish to come up, and we're going to discuss this. But in principle, when the blemish has come up, you're not going to have an issue, and especially if there's no temple. So we're going to see all the factors of how it comes into play. But why it brings this whole thing is we're talking about a case where a Kohen wanted to betroth a woman with it. And in the one Mishnah, it turns around and says, if it was blemished or unblemished, he cannot betroth a woman to it. Does that make sense? It's Kodshe Kalem or Kodshe Kodashim. And then in another case, it turns around and says, well, he can betroth a woman with it. So we're saying it seemed contradictory. Just like when it looked at slaves as movable on land, there were two contradictory opinions. But when we had clarity, we said we understand the circumstances in which one is regarded as in these particular circumstances versus the other. So this is how it's going to be unpacked.
Yeah, okay, good, very good. It's become quite, these concepts are, heard some of them, but they're quite new and quite complicated. But
they are new. And they are complicated. So, okay, so we're going to be doing a session tomorrow. How many minutes have we got left? I think we almost finished.
Can I just ask a question to clarify?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. What do you mean betroth the woman with the ox?
Okay.
Give the ox as a gift, for her to gain a kinyan of that ox. Oh, payment. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So there are three ways to acquire a woman. One is a payment. So let me give you an example.
Okay.
It's not exactly romantic to say, listen, here's a dead ox. Will you have me forever? I think what it actually means in that case is you'd sell the ox and get her a ring. But what we learned is that you can't use stolen money to buy a ring because it's not your money. So the reality is, we learned this in Sanhedrin, is that you haven't really been betrothed to her because you didn't own the ring. You stole it, or you stole the money to buy the ring. And if the Bechor is not yours and it's the property of the Most High, you have no business selling it. And in that particular case, you might be allowed to have use of it, but it doesn't mean you have monetary rights in it. So we're going to learn these things too. Okay. So in order for a marriage to be valid, you can't buy a diamond ring at Stearns on APRO and pay it off every month because halachically you're not married on that case. You have to pay it outright. And that's why today when we marry a woman, we do three things. We give a ring in terms of acquiring her. We do a ketubah, which is a shtar, a marriage contract, and we have beer. We consecrate the marriage with an action, which is sexual consummation of the marriage. And all those three ways validate a marriage, because in case one's paying off a wedding ring, etc., etc. But you can take an item of relatively low value and offer it for marriage. It has to be worth a certain amount, but certainly not thousands. Maybe a couple of $100, and that marriage is valid. But it's better to give that of something you own and something that you're going to pay off. You're going to say, don't worry, babe, I'm not trying to stuff you. You're going to get that $50,000 ring or that $100,000 ring. It's going to be so heavy you can't lift your hand off the table. But just while you get the dollar signs out your eyes, we need to be halachically married. So here's something of lesser value, like a CD player. I'm just saying. That's what I can do for now.
Here's a Coca-Cola ring.
Your Sony Walkman.
Yeah. So it has to be valid.